So since we're now at the officially appointed Michigan time, I will call us back into session. And of course, this is the moment in the proceedings at which you all go to work. I'm going to ask the staff to lock the doors and make sure that no one can then leave. Since the point of this, I'll make a few opening remarks, but then the point of this basically is for you all to give us ideas, suggestions, thoughts, a kind of collective brainstorming session about where we might go from here. A large part of this weekend is about thinking through and marking and recognizing the connections that have been made over the first half century, but of course we want this not simply to be looking back and doing sort of the reminiscences and see where we might go onward from here. I should note that my successor, Olga Mayorova, is here in the room today, and she will be taking feverish notes on everything you say. If you can help her to develop and flesh out her already existing vision for what CREES can do in the next half century, I'm sure she'll be grateful. And I also wanted to say we have an hour. I hope everyone is able to speak up as much as you wish. It's also possible that ideas will come to you towards the end of the hour, or you may feel cowed, although I don't expect many faculty members in a room will feel cowed by public speaking. But if that does happen, or if other ideas strike you later, we have these index cards on the chair precisely for this reason. Other suggestions, thoughts that you'd like to chime in with, please just write them down. There's a parcel of golf pencils on the back windowsill if you don't have something to write with. And of course, if ideas strike you later, send us an email at crees@umich.edu, post it on our Facebook page. This also goes for those watching from afar. We are webcasting this. Everyone wave to the distant audience, exactly. That would be much appreciated. So speak up is the theme for this morning. As for my kickoff remarks today, I decided I would use as my own model Fidel Castro today. He was the last man standing. He was the only one I could think of immediately who could speak easily for longer than Brezhnev. And his personal record, as I've now learned, was 7 hours and 10 minutes at the 1986 Party Congress in Cuba. And this, I thought particularly of George Breslauer, who would love that, who has both the language and the methodological expertise to engage with that sort of text. And so we know how that would be something that would make him dance around in his room with joy at that news. So since we're marking the center's first 50 years, I figured the only way I could Castroize this morning would be to talk individually about all of the 1,000+ alums who have come out of the center's various programs. I'll go through one by one. I'm just kidding. Obviously, I'm not going to do that. But I did want to start by noting the scale of that work over the first half century that CREES has come out of, because from that point in 1961, the center has developed a wide, rich, and very varied footprint in a bunch of different places, many different terrains. And just to measure that in terms of students, which is only one of the ways in which we could do that, I could tally for you, and I won't, all of the 300 or so MA students who have come out of our 2-year graduate degree program, and graduate certificate holders. We have participated, the CREES collectively has participated, as best we can tell, in the programs of about 500 PhD students in a range of different disciplines. At the undergraduate level, there have been more than 500 bachelor's degrees, scores of minors as well. We have 2 minors in place, and as of yesterday, we now have a 3rd minor in place. We're very pleased about that. Central Eurasian Studies is now in place as well. I'm not even going to hazard a guess about the thousands of teachers who have come through and benefited from our outreach workshops. That's a crucial component in the ongoing work of the center, or study trips that have also been facilitated in a variety of directions. Or, of course, the enormous general public audiences that turn up for ongoing events, programs, workshops, lectures, films, art sessions, musical performances of all sorts. The list goes on. So today's session focuses on the future, where we go from that and how we develop out from that point of origin, which is something we could approach in several different ways, too. It's odd to see an historian standing up here to direct a session on the future. We all disciplinarily immediately say, well, I will explore the rich textures of the past. Of course, I can't tell what the future holds. And futurology, as a Endeavor can be seen as, in some sense, doomed. We can't know exactly what's going to happen, and I'm not asking you to predict here. I think that's a misguided apprehension of what we might do. Think about how difficult it would have been in 1961 to predict where we would be right now. Sort of take a moment and think between those two moments in time. Eurasian, in the center's name, would have meant something, but it would have meant something very different. And what the connotations of that phrase and that definition of what it is that we would be doing fundamentally at the Area Studies endeavor would be quite different. One might not have expected the University of Michigan to have an Albanian culture night, which we had 2 nights ago, carried out by students without CREES. That's interesting to sort of think about how that would have looked from the terrain of 1961. Discussions of Georgia as a member of NATO. Think about that. Or having an endowed chair in Polish history with a job talk on, what was it, Keeley, yesterday? The prostitutes, transvestites, sex workers in Poland. Things have changed disciplinarily and thematically as well as geographically in dramatic ways. So you're off the hook in trying to predict what it's going to look like in 2061. We can't unlock the doors yet, but nonetheless you're off the hook with that. I do want, though, to note that the futures that we have, I'm asking you to put into sight, futures also depend on decisions that are made in the past. And our present, therefore, depends on the decisions that were made by generations of those in the past, such as those of you sitting in this room. The layered decisions of many in the past, those connections that Michael mentioned at the end of yesterday's sessions, are embedded in multiple realms of those prior decisions. Speaking personally here, and this is my reminiscence in a way, I'm not a CREES alum. I didn't come here for CREES in the same way that Catherine said yesterday that she had come here for CREES, but I would not have come without CREES. My position was created, my actual appointment at Michigan was created through the action of CREES in combination with Ximenes, with the Middle East Center, with the International Institute, and with others as well, to create a faculty line in Central Asian Studies. This was a new faculty line. I didn't replace anyone who retired. This was something that the university, through collaborative discussions with a range of different constituencies, decided made sense at that moment. I think it's a wonderful idea. Of course, I was not part of that. That was something that predated me, but it originates out of the visions of many other people thinking about what we could do differently, and what it would look like to do that. Also, there are a number of CREES directors involved in that. I see some of them sitting around here. Catherine was director, Michael, Val, Bill, Ron, all of them played an important role in that. So this is the kind of key point I wanted to make, and it's kind of growing in a way, Doug, out of what you said yesterday in your remarks, and I'm glad you're sitting in the front row for this, which was that centers like CREES have flexibility in ways that some other institutions, some other structures of the academic realm may not. And that makes it possible to undertake rapid changes, to bring into being, to create new fields of scholarship, potentially, like the crazy idea of creating Central Asian Studies here. From that decision, I've been here now 6.5 years. It didn't begin with me. It predated me by at least 2 generations of scholarly temporary presences in the teachings of languages in other ways, but it has now developed into an area where we've taught 4 languages, offered classes, had nearly 24 graduate students, a new undergraduate minor, as I said, as of this week, a survey course with almost 100 students that is about the size of REES 395, and at least recently it's been larger than 396. We're now hiring a second tenure track faculty member, all of which means that we have a real going concern in an area that was brought into being by a visioning process, not unlike this one. So, academia can be seen as path-dependent. Institutions can extend, can replicate, can develop themselves and add to strengths they already have. And that's one element of what I'd like to hear from people here today. That is, which are the elements in place now need to be protected, to be sustained, to be enriched, and to be continued. That's a fundamental component of what we should be thinking through and where we go from here. At the same time, what else can we do? What new directions could we explore? What new capacities could we try to develop? Where might the center start thinking through the building of new departures in the years ahead, in scholarship, in teaching, and in outreach? So There are ways in which this has already happened. We have geography. Started as the Center for Russian Studies, developed in 1967 into the Center for Russian East European Studies, developed last year in the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Expansion, redefinitions of our geographic scope. Size, growth, disciplinary reach has also extended. In the early 1960s, the Center for Russian Studies had 16 faculty members. They were in economics, education, geography, history, political science, and Slavic languages and literatures. The 70s, the size doubled to about 30 faculty members. We added anthropology, humanities at the COE, and linguistics. In the 80s, it went up almost to 40. We added business, education, economics was already there, I'm sorry, German language and literature, law, music, and sociology. By 1991, we were up to 46. We dropped geography, which is also worth noting. We added architecture and psychology. By 2001, we had expanded to 65 faculty members. We dropped the humanities, the program terminated. We added American culture, art, history of art, Judaic studies, medicine, Near Eastern studies, public health, public policy, and women's studies. 2011, we're up around 75. We just added, how many did we add last week? 3 more faculty? We had 2 research associates and 1 faculty associate last week or 2 weeks ago. We've added Asian languages and cultures, dance, classics, art and design, and SNRE. That's the School of Natural Resources and Environment over the last chunk of time. So all of this, I'm now going to stop talking at the microphone and let you all start expanding on your own ideas. But I wanted to say this to suggest at least a few possibilities to channel avenues of conversation for the rest of the hour. That is, coverage, either curricular or faculty, which can be expansion, development, and deepening. New kinds of studies. Central Asia is one recent example of an undertaking like that, that involved the cooperation of CREES with other entities. In that case, the Center for Chinese Studies, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, for instance. And here, I want to have us think through places in which new connections might profitably be made. The Middle East Center has encouraged the hiring of someone working in Arab American cultures, for instance. That is a place enriched in and rooted in a particular form of aerial expertise, but geographically dispersed. One of this year's Copernicus Fellows, one of our major investments in the future of Polish studies, is a student in the history department who is studying Polish diasporas. That is, globally dispersed, trans-regionally located communities of Polish-speaking people. This is a different sort of form, a geographic form of scholarship embedded in disciplinary frames that are more recognizable. This is something to think through in collaboration with the rethinkings of area studies and its boundaries and its meanings and its potentials. Information, technological changes, what that means for the subject of our study, as well as the raw materials that we have available for it, for our library investments, as well as how we teach in the classrooms, how we reach non-classroom audiences. I'm waving to the web audience as I say this now. The practicalities of institutional pressures. It's not all outreaching, enriching, enthusiastic, expansionary pressures. We have constraints that we need to be aware of, real important constraints. How do we respond to those? And lastly, serving many different kinds of students. This is something that CREES has distinguished itself at over its first half-century. That is, meeting a range of different kinds of students from a range of different backgrounds, thinking through a wide possible stream of outcomes, trajectories, careers, and thinking through how to help them all get there, to give them what they need without channeling them into a too rigid approach. How have our students changed? Where are our students likely to head into the future, and what new sorts of careers and visions for them can we help them to prepare, while still drawing on the resources of area studies to do so? All of those are headings under which I think we could profitably think and talk, and I hope that gives us a place at which to start the conversation. From this point, I'm not going to say any more. I've said my piece. I hope that helps. We have a microphone up in front. Because we have a global audience, I'd like to encourage you please to come up to the microphone and to share. Don't be put off by its location at the front. I will shepherd us through as necessary, but again, this is now up to all of you. So please feel free to engage with any of those or start new headings of your own.
Anyway, I think that, we have not somehow succeeded, both in the policy world, and I really agree with Jill on this, and in the academy, to really become part of a lot of discussions. I've been doing recent work with Middle Eastern specialists because I work on the diffusion of popular protest. Woo! Happens again. And so I'm struck by, this is also true of the Middle East, Middle Eastern studies. They're really isolated, and we were isolated during the Cold War, but we were also arrogant because we had privileged funding and we were at the top of the heap because we were the other superpower. But we've not taken on the burden, I think, of reaching out. So one of the things I would just put out on the table is doing more, encouraging more cross-center collaborative work. I'm involved in some things with Middle Eastern studies, as I said, trying to reach out to talk about the post-communist waves of popular protests and bringing them to bear on discussions in the Middle East. Another kind of topic, I'm a political scientist, so I will think along those narrow terms, but also, it's interesting to me, there's a huge outgrowth of work on authoritarianism. Do you know that communism is not in the discussion at all? At all. And when I teach it, I do put in some things on the communist experience, but it disappeared. And what's important about that is not necessarily that everyone has to know the communist experience, but people should know that there were authoritarian regimes that had a mission. And they constructed ambitious political economies because of that. It's very different from contemporary authoritarian regimes. But they should know that that alternative exists because it can help you understand other kinds of forms of authoritarian rule. So, and there are a lot of regional studies that could talk to authoritarianism, and historians as well as political scientists, et cetera, sociologists. So I'll just throw that out.
Are you available for exchange? I wanted to raise a question on this other thing. I was curious if you've ever read Martin Creamer's Ivory Towers on Sand.
I know about it, yeah.
I liked the book because I thought that with very few changes in some nouns and adjectives, you would be describing the former Soviet area and its failures, issues that I think that we've never had a very good look at. And I think that the foreign policy failures that we've had, in part, particularly intelligent failures, stem from very serious problems in academia that we should have dealt with after it was clear that we made a lot of mistakes. George, I think, knows my feelings on this one, and we didn't have it. And there's some real scandals there, quite frankly, in my judgment. And there was no reason not to have foreseen and be prepared for the fall of the Soviet Union, in my judgment, and not to be in a position to have policies to effectively engage those societies. And I think that we've had failures in all of those areas.
Just to underscore the cross-center emphasis of Val's comment too, I think that's absolutely something that we should think through in new and productive ways. That's another reason I use Castro, chair of the Cuban Communist Party from 1961, the year of CREES's creation, but not necessarily in the same sort of regional frame of discussion as well. Who else would like to? Yes.
Authoritarian approach to teaching, so you have to deal with that. Well, I've been a fan of CREES many years. I started working there. My first boss was right here, Marisha Ostefan, and I found that it was very difficult to work with her because she was very demanding. But I'm demanding too, so now we're very good friends. I got my PhD here for a time. I was a director of the Russian language program here. And this is what I want to talk about. We usually concentrate on our graduate students. because graduate students bring us names, they bring us fame. But what I found out recently, working a lot with undergraduates, those are people who were born after Berlin Wall fell down. They don't know very much. And I think as Slavists and center holders, so to speak, and Title VI money maker, for the government and getting those, I think it's one of our goals to get back to the grassroots, to get to the undergraduates. And a lot of time, people are not interested in taking Russian and other less commonly taught languages, and if they do that, they will take Arabic, because this is a hot topic right now. But I think we need to think about future, and our future comes from our undergrads. They not necessarily would be taking their graduate studies here, but they will go to other places. And also, one of the things I find absolutely fascinating, what you do as an educator when you take a student in engineering studies. I'm now a director of Russian program at Virginia Tech. And one of the most exciting things when you see this person or your introduction to Russian civilization class, whom you could move, or he starts thinking. I asked them to talk to their parents. What do they remember from Cold War? They never heard about it. They don't know about it. And then, coming from there, we get interest. First, maybe in the language and literature and culture and politics. Most of my students who were engineering students now pursuing graduate studies in politics, Russian studies, in history, and I think this is something we should be looking for in the centers, because if we help the students, if we have a small grant to help them go to Russia, if we have something like a mentor who would, foster their interest, I think that would be very important for our future. Well, I forgot to mention I teach an undergraduate program.
I feel like Elizabeth Dole here.
Yeah, I'm pleased to see Jill Doherty here, especially because I like the idea of collateral training that reaches the world. And it's so important. The thing that was missing in the earlier presentation, I thought, was the connection with business, the connection with the diplomatic community. Living near Chicago as I do, there's a huge diplomatic community in Chicago, and there's a natural affinity there. And I don't have a problem. I've always been policy-oriented. I got some email, that's somehow defiling the academy. Not at all. And there's some people in the government who do some very good stuff. I think the most important thing when you're teaching is to realize who you may be reaching. I remember in my school the number of Chinese students from the mainland, Beijing, and I was speaking slowly accented English because I've been on the other side of that line. I was suggesting to them where they should go to improve their English. Well, TV, and if you don't mind the company, bars, absolutely. I mean, you can't lock yourself into an academic tomb, a sepulcher. And I think there's a problem with academics as a whole, and I was one for 34 years. And I think political science, you have to be good in the discipline, and disciplines defend each other like medieval kings. And a master's degree in international relations, where are you? And in a changing world, some of these disciplinary boundaries, whatever their reasons for their inception, have to be broken down because the world is too complicated and dangerous a place to do otherwise.
So we think in acronyms. So I would say one good deed deserves another, and the acronym is DEED. D stands for diplomacy. But I think what the challenge is that we should not be so arrogant as to think academia can understand what diplomats do and what diplomats are challenged by. And instead, we should be looking at what people like Fred Logeval at Cornell and others do to understand how diplomatic strategies, how foreign policies are made. And they're not made by understanding other regions. They're made by working out American political issues. And so when we think about when intelligence fails, who's that guy at Columbia? what's his name, who writes on complexity and has a book entitled, but yeah, Jervis, Bob Jervis, Why Intelligence Fails, Why We Got Iraq Wrong, Why We Didn't Anticipate the Iranian Revolution. This was not a failure of area studies. This was a failure of the intelligence process. This was a failure of foreign policy. So here's the first opportunity, from my point of view, about how to redo area studies. And that is to think about how the complexity of foreign policy and diplomacy and the complexity of area studies intersect and figure out a better way of connecting them. E stands for, actually EE stands for energy and environment. And this is where CREES really was a trailblazer, path maker. And I can recall all of those terrific environmental students at SNRE and CREES in the mid-1990s anticipating and certainly building what we should have now built into this infrastructure at the University of Michigan and in other places. We're studying not just the social environment, but the biophysical environment, and thinking about the ways in which energy is not just a commodity to be traded, but potentially a resource to be wielded in geopolitics. And to think about that not just for the present, but for the long term. Because in fact, if there's any crisis, it's not going to be around war. It's going to be about whether the planet can survive. So how do you build in that long-term thinking? And that's, again, where diplomacy and foreign policy come in. Because we're focusing on tomorrow's crisis or maybe yesterday's crisis. We're not thinking about the crisis 20 or 30 years down the road. And why? Because, unfortunately, democracy doesn't do that well. And this is where the communist authoritarianism seems to be a really important thing. We had 5-year plans. Well, maybe we need a 30-year plan. And we have them, but they're not part of the public discourse. And this is maybe where we finish the acronym with DEED. And that is to think about the final D as actually having a double accent, being both democracy and digitality. Right? And how those things come together is where we can think anew. I don't want to talk about democracy because there's an emerging democracy center around here that can figure that out. But we can think about digitality in a new way. And I'll just call up one example. Teaching at Brown now, I'm learning a hell of a lot of new things. And one of the things I've learned is that I'm not one of these. I'm not a digital native. But all the undergraduates I'm teaching are digital natives. And we, or at least I, don't know how they learn. But there's a way to start. John Seeley Brown has just written a nice little book on the new learning practices of these digital natives. But it's a great book, but it's only the start because it's so American. Thinking about how digital natives are transnational is one of the most amazing things that can happen and connects directly with what Val is doing. Because these are not digital revolutions, these are physical revolutions. But they have a digital component that enables the travel of ideas that's amazing. There's a graduate student here at the University of Michigan who's in Tahrir, was in Tahrir, but remains in Egypt, but he's completely connected, Atef Saeed. I'm his Facebook friend. And I'm learning a hell of a lot. But so are all of our colleagues from around the world. So that's how I would say CREES has done so many good deeds in the past. But one of the good deeds that is done in the past is to enable us to think about good deeds for the future. There you are.
I just had to follow up on that because the last part about, I'm Jill Doherty, and I'll be on this panel in a couple of minutes. And this has been on my mind so much because I'm a Russian language and literature, talk about kind of antique majors. And yet, as I look around at the world right now, I keep thinking, who are the people who basically created modern computing? A lot of them are Russian. You go to Silicon Valley, where I was with President Medvedev covering his visit, everybody I bumped into is Russian. And yet they're in Silicon Valley, but they are also kind of bi-coastal, bi-national, you know, they're back in Moscow, they're in California. And I think we really, this would be more a question, it's kind of a comment, but also a question of how to yank this field, or let's say especially Russian and the study of, you know, Russia into the 21st century, to look at these methods of communication, but they are really more than methods of communication. You're absolutely right that they change the political equation. And as people are able to talk back in a way that they haven't been able to talk back, it completely changes it. You know, before it was one directional and you kind of fought it, or you had samizdat or something. But now you absolutely have this viral world where people all over the world are talking with each other and changing their societies. And I can tell you, following now what's going on in the Middle East, the Russians right now are worried about that too. Color revolutions. Well, you know, what could it mean? It's not really happening, but is it? There are a lot of digital, you know, people, bloggers, et cetera, in Russia who might want to do something similar. So I think it's not only a trend, it's not just decoration, it is a deeply transformative element in modern societies that I, and I think maybe we, don't fully understand because it is still developing. So I really do think that because Russia and that whole area, I shouldn't even say Russia, but Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, et cetera, that whole post-Soviet space is being transformed precisely by this in a faster way than we've ever seen it before. So again, my head is filled with a lot of questions, but I do think that this could be almost a separate area of study, combining, it could combine repressive regimes. You were talking about that. You know, how does a repressive regime deal with these new methods of communication that have nothing to do with them? They cannot control them. Even when they think that they can shut down websites, et cetera, you can find many different ways. Everybody can get around that. Even, you know, the State Department helps them to do it. So anyway, I think it's a fascinating world, and I think it opens all sorts of windows in this area.
Hi, I'm Herb Eagle. I'm from here, and I lost my name tag. This happens to me. Always at conferences, it never lasts more than the first day. I don't know what I do with them. There are a lot of exciting things that we can do. Certainly this whole digital revolution presents problems and issues where we don't have the training. We have to re-educate ourselves in a certain sense, and we have to collaborate to create new ventures. You could imagine now, right away, some kind of a survey course that would be talking about Facebook across our area. And you could have a huge survey course on that. But of course, we'd have to figure out how to do it and collectively. And I want to call to mind a couple of other points. One, Val's remark yesterday about how she got excited about this field by experiencing a team-taught course and how dynamic that was. And Nusia's comments about how we can interest undergraduates in our part of the world. You know, we always joke about needing some kind of huge military disaster somewhere in our area to get us back to where we were during the Cold War, but none of us really want that. So we need to do it via these new areas, create new courses that might attract a lot of students, and then by virtue of interesting them in one thing, interest them in other things. In other words, the path now is not typically that a student will start learning Russian in their freshman year. More likely, if we get them in one of our interdisciplinary courses, then they get excited and interested, and they think, boy, this is the part of the world I'd like to work on. It's their sophomore year that we'll see them in a language class. It means we need some accelerated steps along the way. But what I see is a kind of institutional challenge that we also have to overcome in an era of dwindling academic resources. That in spite of the fact that the number of center associates has grown, as Doug has pointed out, it isn't necessarily easier to put together and sustain these kinds of collective teaching efforts as departments become more protective of their resources. So this is maybe a challenge for those of us who are already tenured, who have a kind of flexibility in our activities and a kind of maybe leverage with our own departments that junior faculty don't have, to kind of be more insistent about being released for joint and collective teaching efforts and find a way to do that within our respective institutions. I think that's one of the sort of critical kind of administrative operational things that we need to be thinking about.
I'm watching the sea of hands not go up. There we go.
My comment is rather revolutionary, so I hesitate to put it out there, but I feel a partial kindred spirit resonating in the room today. Being an undergrad product of Reese Poli-Sci double major here in 1984, I set out on the beginning of a very long path trying to weave together the policy interests I had and the academic interests that I very much had. And I spent the last 27 years bouncing back and forth between them, very much staying regionally focused on the Soviet space and post-Soviet space, and academically moving into the area of foreign policy and security making policy, and winding up working both for the government, USAID, and NATO for a long time, and teaching at various universities, lecturing along the way, led me to believe that the great divide doesn't end in Washington, D.C. between policy and academia. And frankly, I don't know how we can get brilliant diplomacy, reasonable foreign and security policy without strong academic backgrounds, which are not left behind on the thresholds of our BAs, but are continued upon. I today am still trying to finish chapter 4 of my doctoral dissertation. And I will be doing it by the end of summer, but I cannot separate the two. Now, brilliantly, I don't know if what has happened in my fishbowl life might resonate for CREES, but working within the US government and within NATO, there have been some extraordinary changes made, yes, institutionally, internally in these two institutions, which is what they are, which I think we actually have not caught up on academically. This being in the area of security studies. Security studies is understanding the environment, the global challenges of climate change, the very real effect on food security and water security today. This is something that Central Asia is grappling with already. Russia, for the time being, may be okay, but for political reasons, the West-ness countries are already neck-deep in food security issues. We can only expect this to grow in the near future. Another aspect, I missed yesterday's panel, unfortunately, but the transnational crime, organized crime, corruption, trafficking in women, drugs, illegal arms, and illegal produced cigarettes. All of these add up to very strong alternative actors to the state. States are daily losing control of their own territories and their own economic security. So they're losing means of production, means of trafficking. Now the Department of Justice is heavily involved in this, and George Washington University has the Trafficking and Anti-Organized Crime and Corruption Center under Dr. Louise Shelley. All these vectors converge in our region. What is happening in the former Warsaw Pact region has affected at least the entire Northern Hemisphere. At NATO, to grapple with this, with the new strategic concept released about 8 weeks ago under Madeleine Albright, they have opened a brand new division. If you think it's hard to open a new division somewhere in Washington, try at NATO, where you have 28 member countries having to fully agree on every step taken. The new division is economic security policy. Most of it is going to be focusing on what is happening in the former Soviet space. The crime, the organized crime and corruption radiating from that region, the narcotics, the weapons, the fissile material movement. I could go on and on and on, and you'd all go home greatly depressed. But it is now elevated to a level equal to nuclear arms negotiations. It so undermines and permeates security around the world that whatever is happening in this region on these different themes matters. All that to say, I hunted for it 25 years ago, and thank God found Raymond Tanter and Al Meyer at that time to guide me through the security web. But it has been hard to bring the two together. Understanding evolving security needs, there is still a huge security vacuum throughout the Warsaw Pact. It is still anyone's game. There are possibilities, there are options. If either through political science or CREES itself, there could be more a focus on modern challenges. I don't think we have time for a 30-year plan. I think we are in a 5-year window. Things are getting to be more and more challenging in that region vis-a-vis maintaining stability for the populace so that they can make sound and sensible long-term decisions for their people and their governments. And without security stability, not much else is going to really matter in that region. I think it takes precedent. So I'm a strong advocate to bringing in more political science, but specifically security studies for our region, for the former Warsaw Pact region. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make 2 brief comments. One is that I have been for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years now, teaching about 3 or 4 times a year a course on democratization at the CIA. And this is for the analysts, not for the other side. And what is really striking is that the reason these courses exist is that the way the research process works at the CIA is that people generate very narrow research agendas about one case and one issue. And one of the things that I think places like CREES and training in general can do is to give people a broader vista, not just the transnational, the comparative, the more thinking in more flexible ways beyond this, this little issue and this little answer to it. I've been struck over and over again that that's a very hard sell for these people to break out of. And it also contributes, I think, to John's comments earlier about intelligence failures, that there is a lack of, shall we say, horizontal discussion in the agency. It's very much a silo operation, and a very narrow one at that. And so far, attempts to redraw the intelligence community have not worked, I think. And that's something to also keep in mind.
Anyone else wish to speak?
I just wanted to make one comment. I thought that this session turned out to be incredibly good, and I really appreciate some of the comments. Michael Kennedy, I appreciated yours very much. I thought that they were right on. Some of my concerns stem from, I do think we have to think about long-term things. And there are some issues that we're facing that I think are going to be much more significant that nobody's talking about. I'm particularly talking about, and this touched upon things that you were talking about, peak oil and its consequences. I'm very convinced that we've hit peak oil. I'm very convinced it has very substantive consequences for us. We're not discussing this at all in the public forum, and we've got to find ways to do it because we've got to face up to problems in this area.
Let me just underscore one, actually I'm going to go back to something you said too, Michael. One idea, it's not a D, that you used. I'm a D, so I'll say that. It's an I, which is intersection. I mean, it seems like much of what's been coming up here is a greater mindfulness to the intersections of all sorts of things. And on the one hand, it strikes me that we at CREES, but not uniquely at CREES, people involved in and coming out of an aerial connection should, at some level, be deeply interwoven with the potential of looking for intersections, right? That is at the core of what we do in a variety of different ways. We bring together languages and literatures and histories and cultures and politics and economics in a range of intersecting career outcomes, too. And so what we're trying to do now is to look for new sorts of intersections that are becoming increasingly important while not forgetting those that we've learned about in the past. And that's, of course, the tricky thing. A second form of intersection is the institutional intersection, right? Where we're trying to do this, here at least at Michigan, in a context shaped by the university. And the university has all kinds of realities and structures and complications that provosts and deans and chairs and directors have to negotiate, while still thinking through those other wider institutional intersections and potentials. And lastly, the intersections of scales is something that's implicit in what John just said about oil and resources and so on. I'm saying this as someone who, with a different hat on, teaches a course on the history of the universe, which is kind of crazy. So, which is all about, in large extent, about the intersection between scales and what one sees at different scales of space and time. And so one of them, just one of them, is about environments and what this sort of means. And what I'm struck in is the way that people in area studies see that as, a crazy thing that I would do or other people do, as something that happens out there. And then there's an area studies world too. And there's no reason that those two should be separated, right? We should sort of think about the two in tandem. And that goes both directions. It means that people in area studies need to be aware of all of these other scales that are happening out there, coming from wherever we are now, whatever our particular expertise is, and think about how it could resonate and have potential payback for others out there. Why they need to pay attention to our aerial, territorialized, specified knowledge, while at the same time, those other conversations benefit from our expertise too. And it's up to us, at the people at that intersection, to make that very case. It's particularly urgent, and it's particularly easy to make that case at a moment like this, when politics, democracy, economics, the dollar, environment, disasters, all lurk, and they all come together at these intersections of the general global framing of knowledge, where people talk about these global interactions in a completely non-specified way that can become enriched by the resonance with particular specifics through which decisions get made to take those conversations forward. That's the place at which I hope we can all kind of think collectively to take what we've got now in this specified institutional local spot, and other institutions too, and kind of develop an area studies for the future. So with that, let me draw this session to a close, and thank you all for contributing.